Today we're going to talk about gender dysphoria, so we're going to be a bit more specific than the previous two talks, but it's the same general ideology that will be addressed. Yeah, so I suspect you've heard plenty about this topic, not just at conferences such as this, but at PTA meetings, school board meetings, from the media. Lots of talk about this gender dysphoria thing. The focus of my presentation will be the child. It's going to be the gender dysphoria in children. And the reason for the focus is that it's twofold. I am a pediatrician, an advocate for children, and also because the treatment that is being recommended and implemented on these kids starts in very early childhood. So let's start with the definition of terms. Gender is a term that refers to the psychological and cultural characteristics associated with biological sex. It is a psychological concept and a sociological term. It is not biology. Gender identity refers to an individual's awareness of being male or female and is sometimes referred to as an individual's experienced gender. The gender that the individual experiences. Sex is a biological term that indicates maleness or femaleness, XY for the male, XX for the female. Dysphoria is a term that refers to the psychological and cultural characteristics associated with biological sex. It is a psychological concept and a sociological term. It is not a biological term. Oh, I beg your pardon. Gender dysphoria is a psychological condition in which the individual feels a marked incompatibility between his or her experienced gender and biological sex. This condition is associated with varying degrees of anxiety and unhappiness. These individuals often express the belief that they are of the opposite sex, a man trapped inside of a woman's body, a woman trapped inside of a man's body. Gender dysphoria in children is diagnosed in the pre-pubertal child. That's ages 8 or 9, 10, 11. Of course, the gender and the biological sex ought to be compatible. They should be the same. They should be compatible. So what are the facts? Human sexuality is an objective biological binary trait, XX and XY, like we just said. These are genetic markers. The norm for human design is to be conceived either male or female. Human sexuality being binary by design, the obvious purpose is the reproduction and the flourishing of our species. This is self-evident. This is the natural law. People who identify as feeling like the opposite sex or somewhere in between, we've heard about this fluidity of sexual identity, do not comprise a third sex. They remain biological men or biological women. An infant is not assigned a sex at birth, as people are wont to say. You don't assign a sex to the baby when the baby is born. The baby's sex is determined and established in utero, and it's only evident when the baby is born. So it's not an assigned sex. When you use the word assign, people then will mean, well, if you assign this sex, well, maybe you could assign a different sex. You could assign another. This is just not possible. So, human beings are born with a biological sex. No one is born with an awareness of being male or female. This awareness develops over time. As the awareness develops during the early years of the child's life, this is the psychological growth and development of the child. There is a time when the child may have feelings of uncertainty, maybe even confusion, as to which sex he or she belongs to. A small number of these children will show additional symptoms of unhappiness, dissatisfaction, remember dysphoria, with their biological sex. And some of these kids insist they are of the opposite sex and start behaving like if they were of the opposite sex. These are the kids that will be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. When GD, gender dysphoria, occurs in the prepubertal child, it resolves in 80 to 95% of cases. This is the overwhelming majority. 80 to 95% of patients by late adolescence after they naturally pass through puberty. Remember, naturally pass through puberty without any intervention. Prevalence rates of GD among children have been estimated to be a fraction of 1%. The ratio of boys to girls, depending on the surveys that are done, is about 2, maybe 4 to 1. So it's more common in boys than it is in girls. So these are the facts. What is the science? Behavior genetics posits that while genes and hormones influence behavior, they do not hardwire a person to think, feel, or behave in a particular way. They are not blueprints. Rather, humans develop traits through a dynamic process that we call gene-environment interaction. Claims have been made that the transgender brain microstructure is different from the non-transgender brain. These studies are of questionable clinical significance, questionable validity, due to the small number of subjects and the existence of neuroplasticity. What is neuroplasticity? It's a well-established phenomenon in that patterns of behavior, repeated, long-standing patterns of behavior and thinking alter the brain microstructure and the function. So the behavior pattern alters the brain microstructure. So neuroplasticity is a well-recognized phenomenon. There is no evidence that people are born with brain microstructure that is forever immutable. Brain microstructure changes throughout a person's life. So if and when valid transgender brain differences were identified, which they have not, these will likely be the result of transgender behavior rather than its cause. Let's look at twin studies. All complex behaviors are due to a combination of nature, biology, nurture, environmental factors, and free will choices. So nature and nurture. Studies of identical twins prove that GD is predominantly influenced by postnatal events. The largest study, that was 74 pairs of twin transsexual adults, found that 28%, that's 21 out of the 74 pairs, 28% were both trans-identified. Both twins were trans-identified. Since identical twins contain 100% of the same DNA from conception and develop in exactly the same prenatal environment where they are exposed to the same prenatal hormones, if genes and or prenatal hormones contributed significantly to transgenderism, the concordance between the twins should be close to 100%, not 28%. So that means that, 72%, the 72% of the identical twins were discordant, meaning that one of the twins was trans-identified, the other one was not. So we can infer from the study that at least 70% or 72% of what contributes to transgenderism in an adult co-twin consists of one or more non-shared postnatal experiences or events. So again, it's firmly established that most of the influence happens after birth. So the trans-identification, transgenderism is not innate. There is no single family dynamic, social situation, adverse event, or combination thereof that has been found to destine any child to develop GD. This fact, together with the twin studies, suggests that there are many paths that may lead to GD in certain children. Clinical case studies suggest that social reinforcement, parental psychopathology, family dynamics, social contagion through the media, and others all contribute to the development and or the persistence of these symptoms of the GD in some vulnerable children. So let's unpack this. Many parents of children with GD recall their initial reaction to their child's cross-sex dressing and other cross-sex behaviors to have been tolerance, and in many cases, encouragement. This only validates the child's confusion. Sometimes parental psychopathology is at the root of the social reinforcement. For example, among mothers of boys with GD who had desired daughters, they wanted a boy and they gave birth to a girl. The mother's desire for a daughter was acted out by the mother, actively cross-dressing her son as a girl. This sounds a little bit bizarre, but there are many examples of this. These mothers typically suffered from clinical depression. The majority of the fathers of GD boys are described as timid, easily threatened, exhibit difficulty with affect regulation. These are terms that you all understand much better than I do. These fathers typically deal with their conflicts by working overtime and otherwise distance themselves from their families and the family situation. Some are absent dads. Most often, the parents fail to support one another and have difficulty resolving marital conflicts. This produces an intensified air of conflict and hostility in the home environment. The child's anxiety, the child's insecurity, the child's anger is just magnified, contributes greatly to the confusion that the child is suffering from. And finally, there may be a causal association, cause and effect, between adverse childhood events, including sexual abuse. There is overlap between childhood gender discordance and adult homosexual orientation. There are data documenting a significantly greater prevalence of childhood adverse events and sexual abuse among homosexual adults as compared to heterosexual adults. So is GD a mental disorder? So far, it appears to be that it is a mental disorder. So, until recently, the prevailing worldview with respect to childhood GD was that it reflected abnormal thinking or confusion on the part of the child. The standard approach was either watchful waiting or pursuit of family and individual psychotherapy. The goals of therapy were to address family pathology, treat psychosocial comorbidities in the child, and aid the child in aligning gender identity with their biological sex. This approach has now shifted. There's been a paradigm shift. How is this shift justified? Well, the suffering of transgender adults has been invoked to argue for the urgent rescue of children from the same fate by early identification, affirmation of their confusion, and pubertal suppression. Let me just say that again. The suffering of the transgender adult has been invoked to argue for the urgent rescue of these children from the same fate by doing all these things to them. It is now alleged that discrimination, violence, psychopathology, and suicide are the direct and inevitable consequences of withholding social affirmation, puberty blockers from a gender dysphoric child. The claim is made that GD children will suffer and commit suicide. There is also the claim that because sex reassignment is safe and effective, it should be done as early as possible, as early as the prepubertal child, ages 8, 9, or 10. Again, the fact that 80 to 95% of gender dysphoric youth emerge physically and psychologically intact after passing through puberty without intervention, like I mentioned before. This is a true statement that everyone is aware of, but this statistic is very conveniently overlooked, and intervention is actually what is recommended by the pediatric organizations, by the way. Over 90% of people who die of suicide have a diagnosed mental disorder. There is no evidence that gender dysphoric youth who commit suicide are any different. Therefore, the cornerstone for suicide prevention should be the same for them as for all other children: early identification and treatment of psychological comorbidities. The American Psychiatric Association, in their DSM-5, lists gender dysphoria as a disorder. But they very quickly have this caveat. They quickly correct that by saying that it is listed therein not due to the discrepancy between the individual's thoughts, their perception of reality, and physical reality, but due to the presence of emotional distress that hampers social functioning. Once the distress is relieved, then GD is no longer considered a disorder. Manipulation of terms, you can see this, right? One of the chief functions of the brain is to perceive physical reality. Perception in accordance with physical reality is normal. Perception that deviates from physical reality should be considered not normal, abnormal. This is true whether or not the individual who experiences the abnormal thoughts feels distress or not. Persons believe that he is something or someone he is not is at best a sign of confused thinking. At worst, it is a delusion. Since gender dysphoria is a psychological diagnosis, one would think the treatment for this anxiety disorder would be in the hands of a mental health specialist. But this is not the case. The treatment recommended for gender dysphoria in children includes chemically blocking puberty, lifelong cross-sex hormones, and mutilating surgeries. It's hard to believe, but this is actually what is being recommended. This is the new paradigm. So what are we doing to our children? This is at Boston Children's, it's a children's hospital of Harvard University. So the gender clinic, one of some that was established in the year 2007. So the pubertal suppression paradigm in the United States consists of affirming the child's false self-concept by instituting name and pronoun changes and facilitating the impersonation of the opposite sex within and outside of the home, in the classroom, in the playground. These children are 5-year-olds. They are in kindergarten. 5-year-olds in kindergarten. Next, puberty is suppressed a few years later via puberty-blocking hormones as early as age 9 or 10 or 11, followed by cross-sex hormones and sex reassignment surgeries where healthy body parts are removed, mutilated, and so on. It is sometimes hard when you think about this whole issue and how it's approached, it is hard to believe that people actually think that they are doing a service to these kids, to these children. Puberty is not a disorder and therefore should not be arrested as though it were a disorder. Puberty blocking hormones induce a state of disease, which is the absence of puberty. Puberty blocking hormones arrest bone growth, decrease bone density, prevent the sex steroid dependent organization and maturation of the adolescent brain, very important function there, and inhibit fertility by preventing the development of gonadal tissue and mature gametes for the duration of treatment. They also suppress the development of secondary sex characteristics, which is the reason why they are given. If the child discontinues the puberty blocker, true, puberty will ensue. Remember that puberty happens at about 9 or 10. So this is when the puberty blocker is used. The child's affirmation, or the affirmation of the child's confusion, starts at about age 5. So between 5 and 9 or 10 are 4 or 5 years. So there's 4 or 5 years of affirming this absurdity that the child is really of the opposite sex in all of the child's environment, the home, the school, and so on. There's many examples, and I know that if you look at if you look at the media, you will find examples of terribly unhappy situations. There's a school in California. It's called Rockland Academy, where they have kindergarten children. They promote the ideology and the fluidity of gender. And there is an article that I read not too long ago. There is a 5-year-old boy that decided that he was going to be a girl with the parents' support and not just tolerance, but support and encouragement. And they came to, the teacher was, these are 5-year-olds, kindergarten, okay? And the child was, the teacher started speaking to the class about this, and the boy gets up from his seat and goes to the bathroom and comes back dressed as a girl. So then the story goes that, Johnny is no longer Johnny, but he is Janie now, and so on, and you have to call her Janie, and you have to call her by her and not a him, and so on. So, of course, the children that are there, 5-year-olds, are just very confused, and they all go home, and the article said that this little girl, her mother was giving her a bath, 5-year-old, was giving her a bath, and her hair was slicked back because she was wet, And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she looked like she had short hair. And she started crying, and the mother said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Well, am I going to turn into a boy, Mom?" So this is the confusion that is happening, that is not just affecting the child that is, the prospectus, the child that is confused, but the rest of the children around him. This is the way this lady found out, this mother found out what was happening in the classroom, and she went back to the school and made some demands, Otherwise, she would not have known unless the children bring the information back to the home. This is what is happening in our country. All right, so if the child discontinues the puberty blocker, like I said before, then puberty will ensue. Let's say the child decides later, and the parents, I guess, these are little kids, that they want to go back to their biological sex, so they stop the puberty blocker, So that puberty will ensue later than what was normal, but it will ensue. So organizations such as the Endocrine Society maintain that suppression of puberty, living socially as the opposite sex, are fully reversible interventions that carry no risk of permanent harm to children. Think about this. A 5-year-old boy lives like a girl for 4 years, then has puberty suppressed, and at age 12 decides, "I really want to go back to being a boy." Do you mean to say that these 7 years that the child has been living this absurd lie have had no effect on the child? This is, social learning theory. It just, it blows your mind. Social learning theory, neuroscience, long-term follow-up of adolescents who have received pubertal suppression challenge this claim, of course. Common sense challenges this claim, But unfortunately, common sense is just not very common anymore. So, at least one prospective study shows that nearly all prepubertal children that are placed on puberty-blocking drugs eventually choose to begin sex reassignment. Once you start that road, then the overwhelming majority, very, very few ever come back to their biological sex. So this eventually, the sex reassignment, the puberty-blocking drugs lead to sex reassignment with cross-sex hormones, which eventually leads them to the mutilating surgeries. This suggests that impersonation of the opposite sex and pubertal suppression, far from being fully reversible and harmless, as proponents claim, sets into motion a single inevitable outcome that requires lifelong use of toxic cross-sex hormones, resulting in infertility and other serious health risks. Children who graduate from cross-sex hormones will graduate from the puberty blocking, they will graduate to cross-sex hormones. The paradigm is this: clinical affirmation without any medicine, any medical intervention, puberty blocking, and then cross-sex hormones, and then the surgeries in this order. This is the way that they go, So they will graduate eventually to the cross-sex hormones. And this is given in the mid-teens, usually 15, 16 years of age, sometimes younger. And this is in preparation for the sex reassignment surgery as an older adolescent. Some protocols actually place prepubertal children, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, directly on cross-sex hormones. This stage of the sex reassignment protocol will feminize the boys and masculinize the girls. Cross-sex hormones are associated with dangerous health risks, in addition to all that we've already talked about. Estrogen administration to boys will place them at risk for elevated triglycerides, hypertriglyceridemia, elevated blood pressure, decreased glucose tolerance. These are all risks for cardiovascular disease. The formation of clots and thrombi, thromboembolism, gallbladder disease, breast cancer. What about the girls? Girls that are placed on male hormones, those who receive testosterone experience an elevated risk for lowering of their HDL, which is the protective cholesterol, and elevated triglycerides. Again, cardiovascular risk for the girls as well. Liver disease, polycythemia, which is the overproduction of RBCs, red cells, by the bone marrow with all their consequences. Increased risk of sleep apnea, insulin resistance, and most importantly, unknown effects on breast, endometrial, uterine, and ovarian tissues. We don't know what happens to these tissues in the young girl after they've been exposed to high doses of male hormones. Nobody knows. Prepubertal children who receive puberty-blocking hormones, followed by cross-sex hormones, are permanently sterilized. Adolescent girls with GD who have taken testosterone daily for 1 year may obtain a double mastectomy as early as age 15, 16. This is not a reversible procedure. Other mutilating sex reassignment surgeries are later done to the older adolescent and the young adult. The mental health aspect, again, of this disease, of this disorder, is totally ignored. Totally ignored. In addition to the fact that 95% of these kids would grow out of their confusion if they would just be left alone. But they're not. The first gender clinic was established in 2007. These are all big medical centers, teaching hospitals. In 2014, there were 24 gender clinics, clustered chiefly along the East Coast and in California. 1 year later, there were 40 across the nation. By this time in 2018, there's about, I think, 44, 45 gender clinics. Use of this protocol is growing really fast. And the main reason is that parents are demanding it and bringing patients to the door of the pediatric endocrinologist because they know this is available. So it's not just the confusion of the child, it's child confusion, but parent confusion as well. The parent feels that they're doing what is best for the child, that they're acting in the best interest of the child. So what is the future for the transgender child who eventually will become an adult transgender person, right? So sex reassignment in adults, what are the consequences? Surveys suggest that transgender adults express an initial sense of relief and satisfaction following the use of cross-sex hormones and sex reassignment surgery. However, this process does not result in a level of health equivalent to that of the general population. A study done in 2001 that looked at 392 male to female and 123 female to male transgender persons found that 62% of the male to female were clinically depressed, 55% of female to male were clinically depressed. So this is the majority. These folks have the need of a mental health specialist. They have clinical depression. Nearly 30% of each group had attempted suicide. Nearly a third had attempted suicide. The psychological disorder that whose onset was in childhood was not resolved, obviously, had been maybe even compounded, made worse by this process of sex reassignment. In Sweden, a 30-year follow-up study found rates of suicide nearly 20 times greater among adults who undergo sex reassignment. This demonstrates that while sex reassignment eases the initial gender dysphoria, this dissatisfaction, unhappiness that they have, it does not result in levels of health that are on par with that of the general population. Sweden is one of the most LGBT-affirming countries, and it suggests that the mental health disparities that are found between these folks and the general population are not primarily due to social prejudice, like some people claim, but to whatever pathology has precipitated the transgender feelings in the first place, and maybe even the transgender lifestyle itself. So, we close. Gender dysphoria in children is a term used to describe a psychological condition in which a child experiences marked incongruence, incompatibility, between his or her experienced gender and the child's biological sex. Twin studies demonstrate that GD is not an innate trait. Moreover, without prepubertal affirmation and hormone intervention, 80 to 95% of children with GD will accept the reality of their biological sex by mid to late adolescence. Almost all, 95%, yeah. Affirming gender dysphoria via public education and legal policies will confuse children and will confuse parents, leading more children to present to gender clinics where they will be given puberty-blocking drugs. Going to the gender clinic means that they will immediately be enrolled into this paradigm that we just discussed. This, in turn, virtually ensures that they will choose a lifetime of sterility, toxic cross-sex hormones, and unnecessary surgical mutilation of their healthy body parts. There is serious ethical problem with allowing irreversible, life-changing procedures to be performed on children, on minors who are not young to give valid consent themselves. Legally, a child cannot consent to any procedure. Children and adolescents do not have the cognitive maturity or the life experience to understand the magnitude of these decisions that affect them for the rest of their lives. Conditioning children to believe the absurdity that they could be born into the wrong body and that a lifetime of chemical and surgical impersonation of the opposite sex is normal and healthful is child abuse, in my opinion. Ethics alone demands an end to the use of pubertal suppression, cross-sex hormones, and sex reassignment surgeries in children.
Someone who's used media a lot in evangelization, so I believe in the importance of Catholic radio, Catholic TV, Catholics using the new media. Can I encourage everyone to watch Shalom TV? I think it's a great vehicle of evangelization. And God bless all of you.
Shalom World, God's own channel.